Hi, this is Marcus Singletary. Susan Rogers worked with Prince during the 1980s as an audio engineer. Here, she answers my questions about what it was like working with the man who recorded Purple Rain. Please subscribe to my channel, and here we go. You started out really with R&B.
Yes.
And then you moved into rock with like the Bare Naked Ladies and other artists.
Mm.
And now you're at Berkeley.
They consider themselves the world's foremost music conservatory for popular music. So we have kids who are not as formally trained as you would find like in the Royal Conservatory in other parts of the world, but they all have some formal music training, but it's in popular music styles and on popular music instruments like electric guitar, drum kit, that kind of thing.
What have you learned working in all those different contexts?
One of the interesting things I've been thinking about lately is how the very few sessions that I did, very, very few, that were the ones I really wanted to do, which was R&B and soul music. I just didn't get asked to do those gigs. After Prince, I just didn't get asked. I did some work with the Jacksons, and I did some work with Al B. Sure, mixing for Tevin Campbell. But what I wanted was Barney Perkins's career. He worked with Anita Baker, and I just didn't get it. I didn't get called for those gigs. But I did get called for the alternative and the indie kind of stuff. So that's what I did. You go where the work is. But the cultural differences were really interesting because in the R&B soul records, I did some work with Jesse Johnson as well. It seemed like the control room, rather than be a traditional closed environment, the control room was open. And I'm comparing also stories that I heard from people I knew who also worked on maybe rap and hip-hop, or like my colleague Prince Charles Alexander, my friend Carmen Rizzo. So anyway, you would have an open control room, and you'd bring the neighborhood, the culture, the street in the room with you for inspiration, for the opinion, for criticism, so that you could maybe perhaps better make a work that reflected the life of people in your culture, your tribe, your clan. It was a much more collectivist kind of perspective. In contrast, alternative indie, those are closed sessions. No one comes in, not even the record label. And I've pondered, what's the difference and why? I don't really know. I don't know enough. I know next to nothing about social psychology, so I don't really know why. But it is very, very different. The alternative indie and rock tends to be a very kind of precious and personal statement, whereas other styles of music tend to be a more collective statement. I don't know because I've never made them, but I imagine country records might have something in common with a more collective statement as well, because you can tell the style of music that certain people listen to by the clothes that they wear. Like, if you see a guy wearing a cowboy hat and he's got that big rodeo belt buckle and cowboy boots, he probably listens to country music. And that's in contrast with someone who might listen to alternative or indie or rock. You wouldn't necessarily know what kind of music they listen to. Heavy metal would be similar in that the heavy metal listeners often, not all the time, but often their clothing reflects the music that they wear. So their lifestyle, their clothing, and their music are all sending a signal to people out there in the world, this is who I am, and this is what I value. So there is a difference there. But I think the methodologies, other than that, the methodologies, the way of working was all very similar. I'm at Berkeley, where I see these kids from all over the world. We have a really large international population and kids with a great variety of backgrounds. And because they intend to work with music for a living, they listen to a wider range of styles than the average college-age person. But still, I can tell that conservative kids in the classroom are going to be the kids who like Taylor Swift. And the more adventurous-looking kids are certainly going to have more adventurous musical tastes as well.
Now, how difficult did you find it being a woman in the industry?
It's hard to say because I don't know what the career would have been like if I'd been a man. It might have been better in some ways. It could have been a lot worse, too. I think it's been an advantage working for Prince. He liked working with women, and I don't think he would have been as interested in me if I'd been a guy. I found it easy on the job. The difficulty that I experienced, that my colleagues, my female colleagues experienced, and women today will still experience, is the reproduction. It takes women, it's biologically way more expensive for a woman to reproduce. The toll on her body is much greater. And the toll on her psyche, the toll on her hormones is much, much greater. She's got this living organism that's dependent on her. And you can't do that very easily working those long, punishing hours in the studio. My male colleagues, it wasn't as big of a deal to have a baby. Female colleagues, it's a huge deal. And I and many of my colleagues, we opted to not have children. Sylvia Massey and Leanne Unger and many of us just didn't have kids.
Now, what did you add to Prince's recordings?
A lot of the great engineers, and I don't think this is widely realized, a lot of them came in just like I did, being audio technicians first, and then later they learned to become recording engineers. Now these days we've got programs like at Berklee College of Music where you can embark on a career as a recording engineer, and that's what you study. You study the recording arts. But for me and a lot of guys who were older than I, but from those guys who studied electronics on the GI Bill, who studied electronics in the 50s and 60s, they just came up as radio engineers or basically audio engineers, and then they end up making these great, great records. So that sort of naivete is a little bit of an advantage because you have no preconceived notion of how things are supposed to sound. You're just making them sound what you think, is pleasing to you. It's kind of like folk art in a way. It's folk audio electronics, really being truly untrained in the audio arts. Prince liked that about me. That's what he said anyway. He said, we don't make records that sound like other people. We're different. That's why we do our own thing. We don't make records like other people. So for a long time during the 80s, he valued that. He made records his own way. His engineer certainly made records her own way. So I think what I added mainly was that naivete. I turned the knobs until it sounded good to me or until it sounded good to him. And that was great.
Tell me about the first time you met the man.
The first time I saw him wasn't the first time I met him. The first time I saw him was when he bought a new console from Westlake Audio, and they were just in the process of hiring me. I had been interviewed, and I think they were just going through the paperwork. So I flew out once with this console to help deliver it and get it into the home, and then I went back to California, packed my things, and moved. So the first time I saw him, it was during the day, and it was at his house that he ended up giving to his dad, which was on Kiowa Trail in Chanhassen. It was a purple house. And we had just unloaded the console in the driveway, and I needed to use the restroom. And I asked Sandy Scipione, who worked for him, where can I go? And she said, just go right into the house, in the front door, go downstairs to the right. So I opened the front door, and Prince came flying around the corner. He had just gotten out of the shower, and he was just wearing a towel, nothing but a towel. So that was the first time I saw him, and I thought, oh, great, he's going to fire me before I've even started because I've seen him practically naked. But I don't know if he even looked at me. He probably had blinders on. He was just flying past. The first thing I was doing was installing that new console in his basement studio. The basement studio was just a little bedroom. It was right across the hallway from the master bedroom, which was his bedroom. So I didn't see him because he would either be upstairs or he would be, we wouldn't cross paths. So I'd be in this little room with the door closed. But finally, after several days of work, I finally got this console repaired. I got the tape machine repaired. I had the console installed and at the tape machine repaired and got everything hooked up according to what he wanted. He had left me a note down there, and so I was finally ready for him. So I called Sandy Scipione and I said, can you tell him I don't know what to do. I don't know. Should I walk upstairs and just say, hey, I'm here? That felt like it would be a little rude. So I called Sandy and I said, do you want to call him and let him know it's ready? It's ready for him. And so she called him and he came downstairs. And that was the first time we met. And he came straight downstairs and he looked at me and he asked me some questions and he said he needed this, that, and the other thing done. And then that was it. And then he said, you can go for the night. Come back tomorrow at 10 a.m. or something like that. And then he turned on his heel and he went to go back upstairs and something inside me said, don't let it start like this. It was just a little voice of caution that said, whatever this is that's happening right now, I don't think this is the best way to get started. So just on instinct, as he was going up the stairs, I said to him, Prince. And he turned around and he looked at me, and I stuck out my hand to shake his hand, and I said, I'm Susan Rogers. And he smiled like he was going to laugh, and then he stuck out his hand, and we shook hands really formally. It was kind of like on The Wizard of Oz. It was just very, very formal, yes, shake hands. And he said, I'm Prince. And we both did that little nod of the head, and then he turned around and ran back upstairs. I was really glad that I did that. I think it was a way of saying, this is an artificial construct. That's what nearly all relationships are, whether it's a teacher or a student or it's a boss and an employee. We agree that as two human beings, you're going to play this role, I'm going to play that role. There will be an exchange of services and money, and we agree by mutual agreement that we're going to do this with one another and that either party can terminate this agreement at any time. He could fire me or I could decide to quit. But it needs to start on that equal footing of we are human beings. You have a name, I have a name. We're people first. And then from there, we'll engage in this construct. Something inside me just needed that. I needed my boss to know my first and last name, because I had just moved across the country. I just left everyone I'd ever known. I'd never been outside of California. I'd left everyone I'd ever known to come and work for him, and I wanted him to know me and shake my hand. And he did. And I was glad I did that in hindsight. When I first met him, he was just coming off the 1999 tour, preparing for the Purple Rain movie and album. A lot of the tracks had already been recorded for the Purple Rain album. And he was 25 years old, and he was on top of the world. He just was so happy. His life was just coming into full flower, and he was so happy. The guy that I knew, after Sign of the Times, when I left right around then, he was not as happy. High native intelligence, very intelligent, quiet, sensitive, respectful of authority. I don't think I ever heard him use a curse word. I don't think I ever heard him curse. He had a temper. He could be angry, but he was not foul-mouthed. He exhibited tremendous self-control, tremendous self-discipline. He's obviously a natural introvert and a highly intelligent, sensitive introvert. He needed people to keep the world out of his way so that he could do what he needed to do. Who he is now, I can only guess, because that was 30-some years ago. But that's who he was all during that time. He was an isolated person, probably safe to say lonely, but he probably would have been lonely whether he was famous or not. As I said, he was respectful and he was always good to me, but when he was having a bad day, wow, it could be, he could peel paint off the walls with just one glance. And he wasn't a yeller or a screamer, he was a decider, and almost in a kind of feminine way. When he wanted to shut you out, he shut you out. You didn't exist. That was how he went about getting what he needed in the time when I was with him. He obviously, please bear in mind that the life that I saw of his was the studio life. There was another aspect to his life, his personal life. I saw very little of that. So, unless, we'd all go out to a club together. By all, I mean maybe his band, his employees, the people who work for him. I would go sometimes too. I was usually so busy that I couldn't go often. But, there were a few times where we all did stuff together. Might have been like going to the movies or having a party and things like that. But for the most part, I didn't see his social life. I saw his creative and artistic life. That's what I saw.
Describe his style of music. A lot of people call it R&B, but he was very influenced by Jimi Hendrix even. Yeah,
it was rooted in funk and dance. It's evident that funk, soul, dance, that James Brown and George Clinton, those are his big influences. Sly is a big influence. He's a genius with melody, and he's a genius with rhythm. He's a genius with melody the way Sly was, and maybe Brian Wilson as well. I mean, just a natural pop melody writer. So many hooks, an inconceivable number of inventive, catchy hooks. And he's also a genius with rhythm, and his rhythm was certainly rooted in dance music. He said he used to love Sylvester back in the 70s. You make me feel my heart real. He used to love Sylvester and that dance music from the 70s and the Gap Band and that kind of stuff. The funk, soul, R&B, the funk, you hear it in his bass playing, you certainly hear it in his guitar playing. That's where his roots are, but his strengths are in melody, and that would suggest that, like Kurt Cobain, who, did grunge rock, but Kurt Cobain listened to a lot of Beatles. Kurt Cobain could write a melody. Prince was just one of those, a natural American songwriter who could write a melody. And if he had lived earlier, he might have been working at the Brill Building or something. He might have been writing hits for the classic American songbook. I think that's who he is. I think Stevie Wonder is another example of someone who's cut from the same cloth, where their genius is really melody. Great keyboard player, great instrumentalist. The rock element is not, I don't know if it's rock in the assertive, rebellious tradition or the heavy tradition, like Led Zeppelin. I think it's more melodic rock. Even Purple Rain, I think melody is his strongest suit. I don't think he has the spirit of rebellion or aggression in him. When I joined, Darling Nikki was complete. There was that period where I was just packing up my things in California, and during that period I had just been signed to a contract, but it was during that period that they did the live show at First Avenue at the club that became the bed track for Baby I'm a Star and I Would Die for You. When I joined him, we did overdubs on those things. So we brought those live tracks back into his home studio. He redid the vocals. He redid a lot of parts, guitars and percussion. He added stuff. So I did overdubs on those things. I did Let's Go Crazy, and I did overdubs and parts on Computer Blue and some other things. But like I said, other tracks were completely finished. Darling Nikki was one. Take Me With You is one that happened while much later. We were I think that was the last song that was recorded to be included on that record, and I did vocals with that on that record, and remembered working with Apollonia, Patty Cotero. She had a rough time singing, but we did the best we could. I think that was the last song we did on that record.
And how did the next album differ?
Oh, Around the World in a Day was totally different. At that point, we were working at a warehouse. And at that warehouse, it's where the band rehearsed, and it's where Prince had his clothes made. He had big sewing tables, and Lewis, and I don't remember the name of the other guy who made his clothes. They worked out of there. It was just an industrial warehouse. The microphones in that rehearsal space would come and feed a splitter snake, and from the splitter snake, it would feed a monitor mix console to get the side fills and the wedges and monitors to get sound into those devices. And then it would also feed a recording console. And that recording console was just sitting in the middle of a cement floor on a piece of carpet, and there were some high-fidelity monitors that were in front of the recording console. There was a tape machine and some outboard gear there, and that's what I recorded Around the World in a Day on. For the most part, sometimes some songs would be done at his home studio, but a lot of it was done right there at the warehouse. Really low fidelity. I mean, typically you wouldn't do anything like that, but we didn't care too much about the quality of the signal path. He cared much more about the quality of the ideas. So we did a lot of recording, and recording a lot of things that didn't end up on the record ultimately ended up on other things, like Strange Relationship and She's Always in My Hair. A lot of that B-side stuff was done just like that at the warehouse. When we lost the lease on that warehouse, we moved over to the other warehouse on Flying Cloud Drive. That's where a lot of the tracks for the Parade album were done, in the warehouse.
What microphones?
When he was on stage, he had a Sennheiser D33, and it's just inexpensive. They're maybe like $400, maybe $500 now, but pretty inexpensive dynamic microphone that he loved. And the early pictures of him in the 80s, if you see him on stage, you'll see him with that microphone. That was the Sennheiser D33 that we used in the warehouse, and he used it on stage. He loved that mic. But if we were in the studio, whether it was Sunset Sound or his home studio, we had the sublime Neumann U47 tube microphone, which is a very expensive and wonderful instrument from the 1940s, 1950s. Those were the two mics that he used. So it was either great or awful. But that's the case. I've heard that John Lennon worked with the Shure SM57 for the vocal tracks where the vocalist is really projecting and you need the vocal to function like a guitar or just a rather narrow bandwidth, semi-distorted instrument. Then a dynamic microphone is perfect for that. For ballads or for things where you want the voice to occupy a wider range in the frequency spectrum, then you'd want the better microphone.
You have to find whatever works on your voice, I guess.
Exactly. It's we have to teach the students that you don't just automatically select a mic based on the size of the capsule or the price range or what some other engineer uses. I mean, that's just foolish. You have to the form has to serve the function. So you have to decide, how do you need the voice to function in the track, and then you choose your mic accordingly.
The song was Raspberry Beret from that album. Tell me about that.
We did that at the warehouse. And he commissioned Lisa Coleman to write a string arrangement for it, which she did. She's so good at that. And then she flew in her brother, David Coleman, on cello, Susie Katayama on cello, and Novi Novog on viola. And Prince left us alone. He left Wendy and Lisa and the string trio alone with me in the warehouse so that we could put the strings on. And it was a really fond memory. It came out really, really well. I loved the arrangement. I thought it was just beautiful. Again, that and Pop Life were just classic examples of Prince truly showing off his gifts from melody writing and hook writing. Around that time, he was dating Susanna Melvoin, and I know that Susanna was turning him onto records he hadn't really listened to as a child, like Led Zeppelin and a lot more of the Beatles. She told me this anyway. I assume that it's true. But she was turning him on to a lot more rock records, and I think the psychedelic cover, a semi-psychedelic cover of Around the World Today was inspired, probably, maybe, I'm guessing here, by some of the records from the 60s that he was listening to.
Tell me about Parade.
Parade was when I was coming into my own as an engineer. I was starting to really get a sound now and feeling a lot more confident. We were buying some new equipment as well. He was giving me more autonomy in the studio. He was letting me do more artistically. We did, so much of that in France. So much of it was influenced by France. Some of the tracks and some of the work was done in a mobile truck that we had on the movie set in the south of France. We spent a few days going to London and doing some work at Advision Studios in London. And he sent Wendy and Lisa and I off for a week, the three of us, to London to do some recording. And it ended up, one of the tracks ended up being Mountains, and the other one ended up being Power Fantastic, which did not make it onto that record, made it onto the B-Sides album. But some of the other tracks were done same style in the rehearsal space that was at home. And then, of course, Sunset Sound, because he would never stay away from Sunset Sound in Los Angeles for too long. So in between tours, when he could, he'd love to go out to Sunset. So we did some things out there as well. It's a beautiful record. The first few songs on that record, he told us, myself and Peggy McCreary, who was an employee of Sunset, she worked as the assistant engineer there, he told us, put up the tape. He went out on the drum kit and he said, put it in to record and just let it roll. And don't stop the tape. And he did the bed tracks for the first 4 songs in a row. I don't remember the exact order, but it was Under the Cherry Moon and I Wonder You and New Position, and I forget what the fourth one was. It was a beautiful record, and I think it certainly was a better sounding record than Around the World in a Day. Great sounding record, I thought, from my perspective.
Tell me about the big hit.
Prince and I were in his favorite room, Studio 3, at Sunset Sound, which is the big room, and he had started this Paisley Park Records label, so he was signing smaller bands. One of the bands he was working with was Maserati, friends of Brown Morks, his bass players. So Prince flew in David Ripken, David Z, to work with Maserati over in Studio 2, which is right across the courtyard in Sunset Sound. So Prince was paying for studio time in 3, where he and I were, and over in Studio 2. And in Studio 2 was Brown Mark and Maserati and David Z. So at one point they had finished the song they were working on. They needed another song. So Prince stopped what he was doing in Studio 3, and he grabbed an acoustic guitar, and it was this crappy acoustic guitar. It was this plasticky Ovation. He almost never played acoustic guitar, but he grabbed the acoustic and we put up a fresh roll of tape and he wrote Kiss very quickly. Typically, when I say he wrote it quickly, often he would just come up with chord changes. He'd put a drum beat with the drum machine there and he'd play the chord changes on top of it. Then he would make a quick cassette of it. He'd take it out to his car and he'd sit in his car. He'd listen to the cassette over and over again. He'd write the lyrics in his car. When he would come back in from the car after writing the lyrics, it might be an hour or 2, whatever. He'd come in, he'd do the vocal, lay down the lead vocal part, and then we gave them the tape, and they took it over to Studio 2. Sometime later, I don't remember how much later, it might have been the same day, maybe the next day, they brought it back, and they played it for us. And it was amazing. David Z had taken the keyboard changes, the chord changes on the keyboard, and had used the hi-hat pattern that Prince had laid down. He used the hi-hat pattern to trigger a noise gate, and the noise gate would open and close these chord changes on the keyboard. So it was that classic dun 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 dun. That's just a keyboard player holding down chords, but it's being played according to the hi-hat pattern. So anyway, Prince just loved it. He loved the backing vocals, and he laughed and he said, "I'm taking that one back." And literally, we took it back, and he redid the lead vocal on it. He put his own lead vocal on and finished the overdubs and made it his song. So David Z is rightly credited with being co-producer on that, because so much of that is his innovation. It's a wonderful track and a wonderful single. The last one unofficially I did with him was the Black Album, because I think I did all but one track on that record. But Sign of the Times was a massive undertaking. He was going through some changes right about then. His band was not the least of them, because Wendy and Lisa and Bobby Z were gone. Sheila was in, and so we had new band members. He was considering this Dream Factory record, and he was considering personalities and themes. Concept albums is what he liked to do. And so the concept for the next record was changing. It was going through a few changes. We were recording nonstop, so a lot of times songs would be sequenced together at some point, and it would be called an album. And we would even take it over to Bernie Grundman Mastering on Sunset Boulevard, and we would press side A and side B of an album. So I know I've probably got the acetates of some of those lying around somewhere, but we'd have side A and side B of an album that was never released. And then we would take those masters often. He would reconceive of how the record was going to be, just reconceive of which songs would be the core, the gist, the kernel of the record. And then he would want to record new songs to support the kernel of a new concept. Along with the concept of a record would come a different look and a different color scheme. Like on Sign of the Times, it was peach and black. And just a whole visual aesthetic. He made concept albums at that time, like a lot of people did, but he did that to the nth degree. He really took a concept really far. Other artists, not so much, but he was very fond of concept albums. And I think he still is, to the best of my knowledge. That's what he does.
Describe a day spent in the studio with him.
A typical day would loosely be, if it was a typical day, I would arrive at the studio, let's say 10 a.m. It would be kind of mid-morning, because typically we would have been up all night. So it might be like 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning. I would either get a phone call early telling me what was expected of me during that day, meaning what song he wanted up, if we were working on a song that was already in progress, or if he wanted fresh tape, or what instrumentation he wanted set up, drum machine versus acoustic drums, will it be acoustic piano, which keyboards would it be? I would either get a phone call, or I'd just come to the studio knowing that, we're working on things. So it means you go home, you sleep for a few hours, and as soon as you're awake and showered, you just come back. So there might be a note left sitting on the console, whether it was at Sunset Sound or whether working at his home studio or rehearsal or just whatever. So get there. I would arrive before him, get everything set up as much as possible, and that meant making sure his drums were tuned and all of his guitars were tuned. Everything that he needed was right there, and everything was in good working order, plenty of fresh tape and everything. And then he would come in, and it would usually go one of two ways. He would either start from the very beginning with drums, which might be acoustic drums, or it might be the drum machine. Often he'd walk into the studio with lyrics. So he'd have the song in his head and the lyrics written. He would have been working on it on piano more than likely. And he'd come in and he'd lay down the drums, either acoustic or electric. And then he would build the song up to a certain point in the arrangement, and then he'd lay down the vocals, the lead and the backing vocals, and then he would finish the arrangement by a little bit of trial and error. I think the gist of the song was typically in his head, and he knew how the arrangement was going to go, but there was always a period of trial and error where we'd just try out different timbres and different sounds, different synth patches and things like that to see what would work, and different parts. He might call in another player like Eric Leeds or someone like that. Sometimes he would call in the girls. It might be Wendy or Lisa or Susanna or Jill Jones to do backing vocals. So sometimes it might be Eric Leeds and Atlanta Bliss his first name was Matt Bliston, that was his name. So he would call them in to do horns sometimes. And then I'd be mixing it as we went along. So while he would be performing, I would be tweaking sounds, or while other people would be doing backgrounds, sometimes he'd leave me to do the other parts, the horn parts, or the backing vocal parts, while he'd go make phone calls or do whatever it is he's going to do. I'd be continuing to work on the sounds. He'd come down, and then we'd finish it up and we'd print it. And that would typically take us all the way through the night. It might be 5, 6, 7 o'clock in the morning, and then there'd be a few hours of sleep, and then it would start all over again. That was one way, like if he would come down with a song that was already written. Other times we would start with just the instrumentation, and he would be finding chord changes, finding a chord progression. He'd stop after he had a rhythm and a chord progression, then he would write lyrics, and then he'd come back in and finish it up. But it was, compared to how most people work, it was incredibly intensive and rapid and focused. Other people just don't work that fast or that long without a break. Dinner breaks, I barely remember them. You know, you would, if we were in LA, we'd order out. I'd eat for a minute in the lounge while he was doing vocals. He'd eat when I was cleaning stuff up or, you know, getting things mixed ready or whatever. It was a very Spartan existence, in a manner of speaking.
And then the Black Album, which wasn't released.
What happened there was, while we were working on Sign of the Times, we'd been working on a lot of more serious material, like Adore and The Cross and Sign of the Times. And Sheila's birthday was coming up. Sheila's birthday's in December. So he had planned a party for her. And he wanted songs to dance to the party. So we just stopped the work on Sign of the Times, and we recorded a lot of stuff. Rock Hard in a Funky Place and Cindy C and The Grind. It's just a bunch of that. Just silly funk stuff, just to have fun and dance to. It was done really quickly, and there wasn't the usual experimentation with sounds and with parts, with arrangement that he was doing on his other songs for Sign of the Times, because it was just fun stuff. And then, after Sign of the Times came out, the word on the street was that he was stung by the criticism that his records weren't funky enough for R&B radio. So he kind of said, all right, I'll show you funky. And he took the songs from the Black Album, cobbled them together, the songs that we had recorded for Sheila's party, cobbled them together, and added a few new things. I think I Wish You Heaven might have been on there, and that was something that was brand new. Just a few other things, and then called it the Black Album. Changed his mind at the last minute about releasing it because it didn't have the same degree of care that had gone into, and conceptualization that had gone into his other works. And I'd heard the story that the Black Album was literally on the loading docks. It was ready to go to the stores when it was pulled. And I know that there are copies floating around out there, I've been told anyway. I probably got old cassettes of it somewhere.
And that was it, right? That was the last album you worked on with him.
And that was my last employment with him. I saw him again quite a few times. I would go back to Paisley Park and I'd book the studios sometimes. It was a little awkward for a little bit, but the last few times I saw him were very, very warm, and I guess loving is the right word. I feel such deep gratitude to him for all of it. I never stole from him. I never took anything that didn't belong to me. It never even crossed my mind. All of us who worked for him had to sign an agreement that would say, you know, we wouldn't take his picture or take things that didn't belong to us. And gosh, that was one piece of paper that was unnecessary. A tree could have been saved because I would never hurt him in any way, and I certainly would never take from him. He gave me so much.
Why did it end?
We had finished Sign of the Times. It was out. We were working on a really ill-conceived movie. I say ill-conceived because there wasn't a grand scheme. It was ad hoc. It was after the fact. I think he was floundering for what to do next. And right around that time, I met someone, and I went out on a date. And that was my first time in almost 5 years, because Prince and I had just been joined at the hip, but I was out in Los Angeles working on some music for this film. And I started dating the technician who was working with me on it. And there was one night that Prince couldn't reach me, and he was furious at me the next day. And we were on the soundstage out in Hollywood, and he pulled me into a private room, and he was just furious that he couldn't reach me. And we looked at each other, and I realized, going back to that handshake story, this was by mutual agreement that we would do this. And I realized then, I can't do this anymore. I just can't do this anymore. And he realized it probably wasn't a good idea for us to continue. I needed to start my life, because that was no life. No family, no friends, no nothing. I mean, it was a tour of duty, so to speak. And it is but its natural time course.
So then you headed into the rock and roll game.
Well, when I moved out to Los Angeles, I saw that I was in demand, that people were interested in working with me. But then I discovered I had a problem. I had a big problem. I had gone from being a maintenance tech to being an engineer under one person's tutelage. So I didn't know how other records were made. I only knew how we made records, how Prince and I made records. But he makes records unlike anyone else. So I was quite handicapped in learning the basic rudiments of record making the way most of the industry does it. So I struggled to retain a position in the industry. I struggled to be good enough as a mixer. I was a good engineer, but as a mixer, I really needed to struggle. And gradually, I was able to hang on long enough and do good enough work that eventually I began supplementing the skills that I had learned with Prince by supplementing it with working with other artists. In particular, I worked with Tommy Jordan and Greg Kurstin in 1992, who had a new band signed to David Byrne's label. Their band was called Gegita. And it was a really low-budget work. They had practically no money because they were on this little boutique label. But they kind of taught me what music is. They were two of the greatest musicians I've ever worked with, aside from Prince. And with those two guys, I learned what music is, and I really understood now how form and function work together, and I learned a new way of record making. And thanks to them, I acquired the skills that allowed me to have a good career in the 90s. Greg Kurstin, incidentally, just has been having tremendous success. He produced Adele's single, Hello, and he's just had he's just one of the most successful producers in the country right now. He's been nominated a couple of times for a Grammy for Producer of the Year. And at that time, I would have been in my early 30s, but we were kind of reinventing the wheel in a different way, and that kind of finished my education, so to speak. It helped me acquire the musical skills that I needed to go on and work as a producer and be successful.
Did you work with David Byrne himself?
I did. Yeah, I worked on David's eponymously titled album, his third solo album, and that would have been around 94. I loved working with him. It was just another dream come true because I had been such a fan of his when the Talking Heads first came out. He's a great guy, and that was another highlight of my career, is the opportunity to work with him. What a fantastic guy. Really, really wonderful.
And then what? What happened to you after that?
I worked as a producer and record mixer and a recording engineer all through the 90s, and had that hit record with Bare Naked Ladies in 98, worked throughout 99, and the very last few projects I did were with Laurie Anderson and with India Ari. But I really had my eye on the door. Once I had that hit record with Bare Naked Ladies, I really wanted to shift gears, and I wanted to try college. And I did. I left the music business, and in September of 2000, I entered college as a freshman and started a whole new career. After I earned my PhD at McGill, I was hired at Berkeley, to my delight, and now I'm again amongst musicians, young musicians from all over the world, wonderful young record makers who are making the records of tomorrow. I have zero interest in ever making records again, but I have an intense interest in seeing my students, my kids, make records. I want to see them do great things. And some of them will, not all of them will, but some of them will do great things. And as for me personally, my professional interests are entirely in the auditory sciences. During my sabbatical, I'll be studying auditory brainstem response measurements, working with the Berkeley population here to look for early onset auditory neuropathy, meaning hearing damage as a result of overexposure to, drums or electric guitar or whatever it is. It's just an exploratory study. And I'll also be looking at how the auditory path develops in the midbrain and the pons and the medulla, the auditory nerve, how that develops as a function of musical training.
How has music developed your talents in other areas?
That's a hard question to consider. I suppose it's made me, on a larger scale, more cognizant of artistic works and communication. I suppose understanding entrepreneurship as well is probably heightened from having made records for a living. When you think about it, when you make records, you gotta tough road because you're making a product that is not, strictly speaking, absolutely necessary for survival, and it's a product that we already have too much of. We could stop making music right now, and there'd be enough to listen to. It's not like, we'd run out of stuff to listen to. So it's a real uphill battle. I'm making something and I'm trying to get people to say to themselves, I need that. I want that. Now that's something different. I don't have that currently in my life and I need it. And that gives you sympathy for people who make food, a restaurateur, let's say, people who have websites, who have podcasts, who have magazines, who have newspapers, who have the kinds of things that certainly who make movies or make books and poetry or whatever, who make the sorts of things that are not like the plumbing for our house or our daily bread. We can do without it. So it allows you to see great works of art as the really, truly amazing accomplishments that they are. It is so hard to beat out the competition in the arts. It is so hard that you have to show some respect to the folks who do it. They beat a lot of arts. They must be doing something right. So I suppose music has given me that perspective a little bit and increased my appreciation for aesthetic experiences and accomplishment, like what people do for a living that brings just joy and to our lives or solves a problem, just whatever it might be that art does for us.
What can the study of music teach the general public?
Well, if you're talking about formal musical training, a lot. The intellectual and creative and social benefits of music education for young people is now inarguable. Science has shown, especially in the last 15 years, how music lessons in childhood improves a child's cognitive abilities, especially in like verbal memory and things like that, because just that focused listening to an audio signal increases the strength of the auditory path, as I said, and it also increases connectivity between different areas of the brain. If your child is learning sight reading is one of the most varsity level things a human brain can do because it's exercising the entire brain, the whole brain. It's a really advanced skill. So for young people, music lessons are incredibly valuable, very, very valuable. Also, it helps children in problem solving and recognizing abstract patterns. It helps children with discipline and with delayed gratification. It's so good for them socially and intellectually. And as far as just the general public, I think music functions as kind of as a social lubricant a little bit, kind of as a social flag. There's risks there. There's music that can speak to a generation either eloquently or in some ways dangerously. I think we have to be vigilant of that. I'm not in favor of censorship at all, but our impressions of our fellow man are filtered through the lyrics of popular singers. And we worry, I think all of us who make records worry a little bit about the impression we're giving one another when we have lyrics that are misogynist or lyrics that are maybe hateful or stirring up hatred. We have to be careful of that, but at the same time, we have to recognize what art is. Art is going to be provocative. That's part of its job, to get us to think differently. And the free marketplace can also do the work of rejecting something that it regards as irredeemable or something that isn't of value. We have a difficult problem to solve in getting musicians paid. That's a really difficult problem to solve. I assume that technology and ingenuity are going to solve the problem for the future generation. It's hard to think of a problem that man hasn't been able to solve, especially when money's involved. They usually figure out a way to get it. So I have a feeling that the youth of tomorrow, the young record makers of tomorrow, they'll figure out a way to get paid for their work. I've watched my royalty checks just diminish greatly, and I know my peers have as well, because now files can be shared freely and not paid for.
Hi, this is Marcus Singletary. Please subscribe to my channel.